Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to see people registered from all over the world, and I hope that we're able to provide you with some really interesting and thought-provoking content. The IFM is part of the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering. We bring together expertise across management, technology, and policy to address a range of manufacturing issues. We have close relationships and links with organisations from across industry, government and universities. I'm Kate Wilshire, Chief Operating Officer of IFM Education and Consultancy Services, the knowledge transport arm of the IFM. Our tools and approaches have been developed, tried, tested and enhanced in collaboration with partners. So if you're facing a particular organisational challenge and need support, some of these approaches may be useful. The topic of today's webinar is competing through competences. This approach has been created to help organisations think about their core competences, identify hidden value in unrecognised resources, and target new markets and opportunities. I'm delighted that we have Nikki Athanasopoulos and Andy Jones sharing their insights today, both very experienced in working on these challenges with industry partners.
Hey, thank you very much, Kate. That's great. So just a quick agenda about the topics we're going to be discussing today. So the key elements is that we're going to be discussing what are core competencies and how an organization could use them to both help them make more informed decisions, but also most importantly, gain a competitive advantage. Before we move to this topic, let's discuss first what is strategy, as competencies should form a key element of any strategic process. There are many definitions on strategy, but today we'll be using Chandler's definition, which basically links the long-term goals and objectives of an organization with the necessary actions required to implement these goals and the resources needed to complete these actions. There are two different perspectives on how strategies should be formulated and developed. The first sees strategy more as positioning. That means that a company should understand very well its external environment, its customers, its competitors, the suppliers, in order to help it formulate a good strategy. The second perspective takes more of an internal view. It considers, for example, the available resources and capabilities that an organization may have, and how these resources and capabilities could be utilized or reconfigured to give a competitive advantage to the business in the marketplace. And this perspective really started around 35 or so years ago with the rise of the IT. And recognizing that successfully coordinating and managing IT resources could actually give a clear competitive advantage to the businesses that could do so. So, what should the company do? Use more the external perspective or the internal one? Ideally, should consider both together to create a good strategy. And this diagram shows a design school model. This takes into account both the external environment, the threats and opportunities that exist in that environment, but also takes into account the internal perspective, the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and what gives it a distinctive competitive advantage in order to help formulate a strategy. So let's go through and work through an example to see how this dual approach may, for example, work in practice. Let's say we have a company that produces handheld electrical appliances. Its main products are mixers, knives, and most recently they have started entering the market of pencil sharpeners. So if we just took the external perspective, the market positioning, we'll see, for example, that the company has a very strong market position for mixers and pencil sharpeners, but this position is not very strong, it's rather weak for the knives. Also, the first two products work or are sold in mature markets that have slow growth, whereas the pencil sharpeners are sold in an immature or emerging market, which is expected to have really high future growth. So just looking at just the external perspective, the company may consider, for example, to maintain the mixers as a product, divest potentially from knives, and invest more on the pencil sharpeners. If we now look take the internal view for this company, the picture is quite different, because the mixers and the knives both share quite a few processes, but also quite a few components. And also, in addition, they share the same distribution channels. In contrast, if we look at the pencil sharpeners, these have many new components that are not shared. And in particular, the housing is made from plastic, which the company has no experience on, because the majority of the products are made from aluminum housing. So this constitutes a major risk for this business. In addition to that, the company will have to set up a completely new sales distribution channel to be able to sell this product in the marketplace. So if you just look at the internal point of view and the internal perspective, this company should possibly, should certainly maintain the mixers, should think potentially to invest more on knives to gain a better market position or strengthen its market position, and potentially reconsider or even stop the activity around the pencil sharpeners. So we talked about the strategy, but what about competences, which is the topic of this webinar? So before we start talking about competences, a little definition on that. And we start from the bottom, which is the resources. And a resource is a tangible or intangible asset that a company may have. A tangible can be, for example, equipment or facilities. Intangible can be knowledge, expertise, or human resources. So when these resources are coordinated, we call that an activity. And when these activities are coordinated, there's a higher level of coordination. This creates a competence. So the competence really requires linkages between different activities and interconnections to make it viable. So it's this higher level of interlinkages and interconnections that make activities sustainable and create competences in an organization. And there are two types of competencies. There are so-called the generic ones, which any company should have in order to maintain some professional operations. And this can be, for example, a finance system, or it can be a HR process or a health and safety process. And they're the so-called core competencies. And these are a distinguished combination of capabilities that the organization may have, which is uniquely valued by its customers. And there is a clear link between core competences to strategy. So good strategies should consider and use and exploit to the maximum advantage the core competences they have in order to gain advantage in the marketplace. A business could be strong or weak on a core competence. And this sounds a bit contradictory, but for example, if a company uses a core competence to enter a new market, it may not be, that core competence may be not strong in that new marketplace. Or a company may not have the correct set of core competencies that it requires for it to meet its business objectives. And we'll discuss a little bit about that later in the webinar.
Thank you, Nikki. So we're just going to move on now to walk through a process for identifying core competencies. And we want to do that using a real case study example. It's been anonymized, but it was an SME looking to grow their business, and we were supporting them with their strategy development. So on the next slide, we first set out looking at why do people buy from them? Why would people buy their products and not their competitors? What are the order winning criteria? How is business won in their chosen markets? Is it price, quality, particular technical expertise? And so for this particular company, on the next slide, we identified 4 particular order winning criteria, 4 ways that they win business. And it's important to say here that this was not identifying the order qualifying criteria. This is once you've got to the table, once you're able to play and look to win business, how do you actually get those orders and beat the competition? So these were the 4 for them. Once the customer benefits had been identified, then we were then able to move on to look at exploring the competencies. So on the next slide, we've got just an example of unpicking that particular order winning criteria of delivery performance, and then sitting with the team and looking, well, what are the actual competencies that you have that underpin that enable you to achieve that delivery performance? So that's done for each one of those identified order winning criteria. In addition to the order winning criteria, on the next slide, we also needed to identify some of their transformative competencies. So the actual processing capabilities that this particular SME had, because again, potentially there were core competencies sitting within those processing capabilities. So after doing this for each one of the order winning criteria, we end up with a long list of competencies. But the question is which ones are actually core competencies and which are those generic competencies that Nikki referred to earlier. On the next slide, we've got some evaluation criteria to identify the core competencies. And there are 2 dimensions here. So there's a dimension around value. How big an impact does this particular competence have on your business? How much does it contribute to, for example, profits? And then the other part of value is how rare is it? How how much of your competition actually have the same competence as you? Or is it actually very rare and you have that and others don't? The second dimension is around sustainability. Could a competitor easily acquire this competence? Or is it actually something that maybe has been built up over years with some intangible knowledge inside your business, so it's difficult to copy? And then the other aspect of sustainability is around, are there any alternatives? Could the same end result be achieved in a different way? So those are the dimensions around evaluating the core competencies. So for this, once you have those dimensions and you have your list of competencies down that left-hand side for this particular case study, then it's a simple scoring mechanism, scoring 1 to 3 for each of those elements of the dimensions that I just mentioned, and then a simple summing exercise. So you'll see if you total 12, like this particular example here, then that's scoring high for each one of those elements, then this is something that would be deemed to be a core competence. On the next slide, please. This is a part of the work done with this particular company. You'll see that there's a dotted line there around in-house end-to-end processing capability. So sort of in practice for competencies that score 10 and above, then it tends to be important to have a discussion and review the scoring and say, is this actually something that is core, or is it actually something that is generic? And it's good to flag here as well that the generic competencies are still really important. So just because they're not core doesn't mean that you don't need to do them well. If you underperform in an area of a generic competence, it could easily be detrimental to the business. So on the next slide, we've then got our list of core competencies that have been derived for this particular case study company. And that was really then the building blocks and the backbone for them to then take forward to think about the strategic choices and those opportunities for growth that they were looking for. So I'll pass back to Nikki now.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I'm just trying to unmute myself. So when a company has identified the core competencies, the question is how you can use that to gain a competitive advantage. So how you can ensure that these competencies are the right ones. And the key element here is that you have to link these competencies to the strategic options or the operating model that the company has selected to operate in. What does that mean? For example, if a company operates on or competes on price and being the cheapest, let's say, in the marketplace, then having competencies around process simplification, that helps them to reduce non-value add activities, or competencies around product standardization, or ways to reduce the distribution cost or the production cost and manage that really, really well, it will give them a competitive advantage. If the company competes on innovation and product differentiation, for example, competencies around creativity, how to manage really talented people, cross-functional working processes in the business. These will be important competencies required to make this business successful. And it has to have them to move forward. So if the company, for example, is much more of a service provider in the marketplace, then competencies around modular product design, for example, that can assist with fast and rapid customization for different customers, or account management processes, or even decentralized operations, that will be quite important for them to be able to provide this customized service to their clients. So the second step is to do these linkages of these links between the operating model of the business and the competences the business has to ensure that they are well matched. So identifying the competence is an important element of any strategic development. And having done that properly, it really helps a company to make reliable and insightful decisions about which competencies are important now, which potentially requires for the future, and how to sustain or discard competencies that don't anymore need. Also, it might help identify underutilized or maybe unrecognized resources that it could coordinate to create competencies for the business. And it helps to sustain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Also, it creates, it's almost like a risk elimination, because it helps create safer decisions on what to divest and what to maintain in the business, and reduce risks when you're trying to enter new markets or develop new products for new or existing markets. And so we're open for questions and answers now. So Kate, maybe you can direct us.
Sure thing. Thanks, Nikki. So a few questions have been submitted. The first was a point of clarification. Andy, what does DFM stand for?
Yes, apologies for that. I did message back on the chat. It's Design for Manufacture.
Excellent, thank you. So a couple of questions. The first one is actually COVID related. So do we think that, or do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic is forcing companies to investigate and apply new competence tools to support operations?
Do you want to go, Nikki, or shall I?
Either. You can go, Andy, and I can support.
I think inevitably, we've all seen that businesses have had to pivot as a result of COVID-19. And so that in terms of safe strategic decision-making, identifying core competencies, and then developing new business models, but still exploiting those core competencies has been really important for people. And looking to find new competencies has definitely been something that people have had to do. In terms of finding new core competencies, I think if you look at the definition of core competencies, whilst they're dynamic, you'll see they take some time to build up. So I think it's making companies really think about their core competencies and think about what they need to develop for the future to support these new business models. The important bit here is to know what your core competencies are, because if you can build your new strategy on those existing core competencies, then that definitely is more likely to achieve some form of success. Nikki?
Thank you.
Yes,
Nikki.
I think we have seen actually quite a few nice examples of companies that reconfigure existing resources and competence they might have. For example, they had a particular production process to re-engineer or to create instruments to support COVID-19 or test. And so companies, I think that they were quite aware of the key capabilities. They were quite responsive, and they could actually meet the requirements of a crisis, a global crisis like COVID-19.
Thank you. I've got a question that's just come in from Wasim Khan. He asks, how do you augment, or how to augment competencies in the SMEs of the next 11 countries?
What is the next 11 countries?
I'm not sure. Wasim, maybe you can clarify your question in the chat. I see that that's just come in on the Q&A. I'm going to move on to the next question, and then maybe if you can clarify, we can come back to that one. The next one I've got is about engaging all parts of the organization. How would you both recommend that companies engage all parts of the organization for the best results?
So firstly, sorry, Andy. Sorry, Nikki. Sorry. Okay. So firstly, I think it's important to say it's a great question, because engaging all parts of the organization is important. Firstly, it's important that everybody knows their company's core competencies, because you do want to protect and sustain them. But also to identify them, you need to do that as a cross-business activity. The core competencies hold value for the customer. And so you really do need to engage all parts of the business in identifying them and then building on them moving forwards. We would suggest that this process that we've just shown you of identifying them and then scoring and discussing together is a great way to engage cross-business, cross-functional input, and to engage that group of people in a session doing that together. So it's a great question, and we would advocate it, but this is an easy way to actually do that as a group.
Thank you, Andy. Nikki?
Yeah, and if I add to that, one key element of the core competence is that it needs to give a distinguished advantage to a customer. So having people from all parts of the organization participating, people from the marketing, the sales, that they have maybe the voice, they know the voice of the customer, but also from production and engineering and R&D, is the best way to actually identify these core competencies in the first place. So you have all the perspectives together.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm just going to go back to the question about the next 11. So that's specifically a group of 11 countries who have emerging markets. So amongst that group is Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan. How would you see that working for countries or companies in countries that have emerging markets?
I don't see any particular difference necessarily between competences in emerging markets and or developing competences or augmenting competences for emerging markets or established markets. But obviously the difference is that they need to identify or to understand their marketplace really well. So don't try to replicate maybe what SMEs do in the developed world already, because they might have different customer requirements. But augmenting competences generally takes the same steps in the sense that you have to understand the value to the organization and to your business, and also to interlink these processes and expand. You know, so if you have a core competence, let's say in the production system, for example, is around cost reduction, could you actually interlink that with other processes in your business? You know, could you actually expand that and make it much more widely useful or used in the business, and create these interconnections and the interlinkages is the key element, I think, to augment and sustain them.
Thank you. A question for Andy here. It says, from my experience, competences are important for strategy. How do you deal with that in your highly considered road mapping workshops?
So I'm assuming this is referring to the strategy, somebody who's experienced the strategy workshops that we deliver. And in that particular instance, then we would develop the competencies through the models that we've just talked about, and then use them appropriately on the roadmap. So yes, competencies can appear on the bottom layer of the roadmap. I'm assuming I'm talking to someone who knows about this. So in the how layer of a roadmap, they're really important. And we would capture the core ones in the same, using the same methodology we've just talked about, and then use them on the landscape or the topic roadmaps accordingly.
Great, thank you. Nikki, anything to add on that?
No, I think this will be the process. So it will form the bottom layer of the roadmap, the top being the external environment, the middle being the value creation layer, let's say the product, the services, the systems that the business has, and the bottom being the competencies, the resources, the capabilities that the firm has.
Thank you. I have a question here from Karen Green. To what extent are the competencies required by low cost and innovation operating systems required by all businesses? And the example that Karen gives is cross-functional working and process improvement.
Okay, so some, they will be required in a basic sense, these things will be required, but the core competency is the extent that, or the level of interconnections that these competencies are, are implemented in the business. And for example, cost will be important, you'll have a baseline, but when you price driven, you might control very, very well the cost of a particular production process or the labor cost, to a few percent potentially, or trying to minimize non-value add activities in your production, let's say. But if you run an innovation business, although you have, of course, to keep an eye on the cost, you may experiment more. You may tolerate, you might even spend money to experiment and create prototypes that they may never make it to market. So it's completely different mindset. So in a basic level, all of these things will be required, but to the extent that these are developed and implemented in the business will be different, and that constitutes the core competence. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
I think that's fine. I'm going to move on to the next one now, which is again about COVID conditions. What competences do you think are the most influential in the current conditions, in your opinion?
I think I would say it depends on the sort of business that you're in. Mm. So different businesses are adapting in different ways to the COVID situation. And those different businesses are potentially needing to attract new competencies in order to survive or to change their business models and pivot. So I think I'm afraid it depends on your business sector. I don't know if Nikki wants to add any more insight to that.
No, I would agree with that. But I would say things potentially like fast learning, ways to learn fast and adapt, and flexibility of the workforce, or potentially even the product, if you are a producer, the production systems you have, this will be probably useful overall, but it will be very case by case.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about the external approach. Do you think there are any instances where an external approach is preferable to a resource view? Nikki?
You mean to use data solely?
Yes.
I would say the balance probably will be preferable in most of the situations. I cannot think of a particular example that only the external view will be useful.
Okay, Andy.
I agreed with Nikki. I think Nikki showed an example working through of how there are two different lenses of way and different ways to look at it, and by using them both in conjunction, and it gives you a balanced view. And again, it comes down to better strategic decision making. So I think I would say look at both.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a couple more questions to cover, so just a few more minutes. If you have any more questions for the panelists, then do put them in the Q&A now. The next question I've got is, how do companies know that the core competencies they possess have the potential to yield competitive advantage? Nikki.
Well, the competitive advantage comes not just by having the competencies, is by linking the competencies to the operating model of the business. So only by having this insight or this knowledge, if you want. So you need to have identified or have agreed, let's say, using the external perspective about how this business is going to operate. You know, as I said, the three examples, I mean, there are different models, but we use the WIS matrice one in this particular case, which shows if you're sort of a price-driven or innovator or service-driven organization. So only by linking your core competencies to your operating model, you can actually gain insights if you're going to have a competitive advantage in the marketplace or not. Because if you don't have the right competencies, it's very unlikely you're going to make a difference in the particular market you're trying to, or either you operate or you're trying to get into.
Great. Andy, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't think I really do, actually, no. I think Nikki's answered that perfectly.
So my next question is for you, Andy. How would you augment competencies in legacy manufacturing systems?
So I think we touched a little bit on augmenting competencies earlier. I think that, again, we talked about the way that you calculate in the first place or identify those core competencies. So if you go back to that, is there anything that you can do to continue to keep them at those kind of higher scoring levels? So can you increase the complexity? Can you make it harder for someone to replicate? Can you enable yourself to have that core competence for longer? But it's worth remembering that competencies are dynamic, and as your competition catches up with you, something that could have been core could well become a generic competence, and you'll continually, as a business, need to be developing that competence base so that you can retain the competitive advantage moving forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that's it for questions at the moment, unless there is anything that you wanted to add on that, Nikki?
No, thank you very much, Kate, for facilitating the Q&A session. And thanks very much for everyone that joined us from all over the world for this webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much for joining us today and for posing such interesting questions for our speakers. We really hope to see you on another webinar soon. Have a good day. Thank you.